Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. In 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker said not 1 inch eastward when he gave his assurances to the then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastwards. Well, the U.S. did not keep its promise, and after being warned many times that Moscow would not allow the U.S.-led military alignment to come to its doorsteps, Moscow declared a special military operation on Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump said if he became president, he would end the war in 1 day. Well, Trump has now been in office over a year, and the war shows no signs of ending. Let's take a look at this report.
Have been ripped off for more than
Before returning to the White House, Donald Trump made a bold promise. He said he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office.
If I were president, and I say this, I will end that war in 1 day. It'll take 24 hours.
He repeated it dozens of times on the campaign trail. 4 years into the war, 1 year into his term, that promise remains unfulfilled. Fighting continues with no end in sight. The war has brought staggering human cost, although exact numbers remain unverified, with no independent access to front lines. On the Russian side, estimates range into the millions of casualties. Ukraine reports tens of thousands of its own soldiers killed. Civilians have paid a heavy price as well. The UN estimates thousands killed and wounded, with millions more displaced from their homes. 3 rounds of U.S.-mediated talks this year in Abu Dhabi and Geneva have produced little beyond prisoner exchanges. Territorial concessions remain the main sticking point. Moscow has its own conditions. Russia demands Ukraine withdraw from the roughly 20% of Donetsk it still controls. Kiev refuses. When Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked whether there would be more wars after Ukraine, he had this to say.
No, there will be no operations if you treat us with respect. If you comply with our interests, respect our interest, as we always try to respect your interests. If you don't try to play dirty tricks with us, like it was with the NATO eastward expansion.
Meanwhile, Ukraine kept demanding more funding and vowing victory rather than accepting Russian terms. Allies have poured over $300 billion into Kiev since 2022, yet the front line has barely moved. Complicating matters further, unity in the West is cracking. Hungary is now blocking the EU's 20th sanctions package against Russia and a €90 billion loan for Ukraine because of an oil pipeline outage that Budapest blames on Kiev.
This is purely a blackmailing against Hungary to change our position. The ball is on the court of Ukraine. As the Ukrainians, when they're going to restart the oil deliveries of Hungary. As long as it doesn't happen, there will be no change in the Hungarian position.
So what has 4 years and 1 year of Trump's so-called peacemaking achieved? The front line has barely moved. Deaths mount, sanctions falter, and the war drags on. European analysts say neither side is close to losing the ability to fight. Ukraine has weathered the pullback of U.S. aid. Russia's economy shows strain but no collapse. Both can continue for years. Perhaps the question was never whether Trump could end this war. Perhaps the question is whether Washington truly wants to. With U.S. threats mounting against Iran, long-term hostility towards China, and continued support for genocide in Gaza, one wonders, if peace is the goal, why does the world keep getting closer to war?
I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Sarah Bils, retired U.S. Navy officer out of Seattle, Washington. DeBar, journalist and commentator out of New York. Thank you both for being with me. It started off with Sarah in Seattle. Your perspective, I mean, had NATO not expanded eastward, would Russia still have invaded Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely not. No. The eastward expansion into Ukraine, Georgia, and the Eastern Bloc, former USSR, is absolutely one of the catalysts of the special military operation in Ukraine.
So staying with you, Sarah, so was this a conflict just driven by deeper geopolitical ambitions?
Well, no, there's a historical precedent here. The CIA has been utilizing Ukraine as a jump-off point and a proxy sort of orphanage for these forces that they can train to attack Russia. So this has been a long time in the works. It just came to a head in 2022. So this has been something, Ukraine has been a tool that the United States has used against Russia for almost a century.
Well, Don, I mean, your perspective, did the Joe Biden administration underestimate Russia's perception of NATO expansion as an existential threat, or was the confrontation seen as strategically inevitable?
Well, it's a strategic plan being implemented by the West that's been thwarted so far to a degree by Russia and Belarus and Kazakhstan and China and several others. You know, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union pushed all the way to Berlin, and the meeting of the U.S. and U.K. troops, where they did meet at the Elbe, was engineered. Actually, the Soviet Union could have just as easily pushed further west. What was designed then was a modus vivendi. Basically, we got to remember that most of the strategic planning that took place at the head of state level, summit level, was with President Roosevelt, who had begun diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in his first year as president in 1933. This was something that it took the United States from 1917 to 1933 to acknowledge that the Soviet government was the government of Russia and a few other countries there. The post-war vision that Roosevelt had was quite different from the one that was implemented in his death in March or April of the last year of the war, when his Vice President Harry Truman took over, took a very belligerent stance and started making plans, as a matter of fact, to build atomic bombs to take out all of the Soviet cities by 1951 or 1952, looking at a production schedule and a military plan. And because the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb before that plan reached fruition, that they had to stop and regroup. What developed was a modus vivendi along the line pretty much of the Elbe in Germany, and that included Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Albania on the east, and Germany, Switzerland, Italy, etc. on the west. And that lasted until 1989, when the Berlin Wall was overrun. And there had been a great deal of agitation that was done in Eastern Europe by CIA and others of the nationalities issues, because there was basically a Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe to keep, if there was a war that was going to happen again with the West, they wanted it to start out there instead of at their border like had happened with Germany. Okay. The United States has the ocean and Western Europe between it and the Soviet Union. And as they took that defensive perimeter apart, they started to move eastward. And now, the year that they took Ukraine, 2014, they also were trying to take Belarus and almost did, and Kazakhstan and almost did. They had already taken Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and the Baltics. These are parts of the Soviet Union, not just countries that the Soviet Union occupied or formed alliances with, but part of the Soviet Union. Okay. They also took into NATO, which is way past the Elbe, which was where this division was supposed to continue. So this is a plan that is now at the point of being active combat on Russia's border. And now we're hearing from the White House, as a matter of fact, that, well, we're really looking at a new order where might makes right, and we've got the might, and we've got the guns to your head. Do
Okay,
what we
stay
tell
with
you,
me,
we're
Don.
gonna go to war.
Let me get Sarah
That's where
back
we
in
are.
on this discussion. I mean, Sarah, what's your assessment of the leadership of the Ukrainian President Zelensky during this war? I mean, were there missed diplomatic opportunities before the invasion?
Well, absolutely, but Zelensky sort of played to his European sponsors and disregarded those chances for peace. Now I don't think that there's any chance for Zelensky to do anything. He's at the mercy of all of his patrons. So he just has to kind of go with what's going on now.
Well, staying with you, Sarah, I mean, to what extent has Ukraine exercised any type of independent decision-making, and to what extent is really the Western, as I call it, hegemonic front control this situation?
Well, I may be biased, so I'll preface by saying that, but I don't think that Ukraine ever has had any real sovereignty, not even since 1991 when it left the USSR and declared its independence. It immediately became a proxy for Western interests against Russia. And so I don't know that they've ever been able to make a sovereign decision. And when they've attempted to do so, it's resulted in things like the Orange Revolution, the Maidan, and now we have, well, there was the Civil War, the ATO, and now we have the SMO. And so, no, Ukraine has not been able to exercise their sovereignty, and that's mostly due to the West.
Mm-hmm. What about that, Don, if you agree with what Sarah said? I mean, so what? In the middle of all this, NATO, led by the U.S., is basically, they were just willing to sacrifice the Ukrainian people for their own goals, because obviously it was known that the Russians were going to react to this eastern expansion?
Well, I would say that, allowing that to happen to the Ukrainians runs entirely against the heart of the American strategic vision. Take a look, for example, at how the people of Iraq are thriving now, or Libya, or Afghanistan, or Syria, or all of the other places that the United States has, tried to bring democracy and prosperity. I think they look at each of these pieces on a chessboard as exactly that, inanimate objects, or worse, that they actually have contempt for human life and human achievement, if it's done by anyone else. And I think that they have absolutely no regard for the people in Ukraine, other than how long they can use them as a weapon against Russia.
Well, Sarah, why has U.S. support for Ukraine remained in place, despite Trump earlier saying he would reduce that support or totally curtail it?
I think that there's something that what people seem to disregard is the war machine that has sort of developed between Ukraine and Israel, which benefits the sort of tech sector in the United States. Obviously, weapons are tested on Palestinians in Gaza. Drone technology is tested in Ukraine, and all of these things benefit the American tech sector. When Trump said, I'm going to end this war in 24 hours, I jokingly said he means he's going to end the public war. Everything else will be privatized, and the money will go into the coffers of the tech sector, and it is. So that's why the war isn't ending. Actually, Trump has upped the arms shipments instead of decreasing them, and that's all to the benefit, again, of our tech sector, folks like Palantir, Anduril, and even people like Elon Musk.
What about that, Don? I mean, so why did Trump say that he would reduce it? But now there seems, on the one hand, there seems to be a schism at times between Washington and the European capitals dealing with Ukraine. But in reality, as Sarah has just said, we've even seen an increase in the support. So what's going on? How do you see it?
I think when you say, for example, when one says that when Trump speaks out of both sides of his mouth, on one side speaking, this peace stuff. On the other side, he spoke very clearly, in essence, military Keynesianism or Keynesian militarism, you take your pick. Part and parcel of making America great again as an industrial power, manufacturing power, whatever. Very heavily, he advocated for weapons sales, weapons production and sales, that these were great job creators. As a matter of fact, the entire approach to NATO reflected that when he was making all of the other countries of NATO, fund up their percentage of GDP to weapons sales. The main purpose for that, of course, is when you buy weapons, when we sell weapons and you buy them, we give you weapons and you give us cash. And so I think that this is an institutional problem, and it's one that he was, acknowledging. Now, the question is, what are his, and it's an impossible one to answer, but the question for trying to do analysis is that, what is his real intent? And in any event, regardless of its intent, what's going to be the likely outcome of this? Either we're going to continue on the path of just producing weapons and then ultimately using them and being on fire for a few hundred years or whatever, or he's trying to navigate, demilitarizing by buying off the people who are the shareholders or decision makers in the arms sector. I don't know which it is. Maybe he thinks he's doing both, but we'll see what happens. And I'm scared of what might happen.
Well, Sarah, your thoughts about that? I mean, do you see that there's a divide in Washington? Because as you said, you talked about the tech sector. Actually, this is benefiting them and, of course, in general, the whole military-industrial complex. But on the other hand, it was not necessary for Trump to say that he could end the war in a day or to say that he's no longer supporting Ukraine. I mean, do you think there is an actual divide there, or what's going on?
I think there once was a decent divide within the MAGA movement and on the right, where, a lot of these sort of America firsters were saying, let's just get out of the war in Ukraine. It's a drain on us. It's a bane, sort of an albatross around our neck. And then Trump utilized that to campaign on, which is what Trump does, the art of the deal, and promised to end it. And that was the support for ending the war in Ukraine has dissipated only because Americans can't pay attention to so many things at once. And that has sort of dropped down on the list of priorities. And so I don't really see the divide that much. There might be some divide within the regime and within the administration on the issue, but within the populace, I don't think that Americans are even thinking about Ukraine right now. It's so low on the priority level.
Yeah, indeed, Americans are being bombarded by so many other domestic issues, indeed. But Don, I mean, let's talk about the difficulties or the realities that it would take really to try to end this war. What are the main challenges?
Well, the institution. You have a militarist global empire on one hand, and some guy trying to stop them on the other. If you actually have that guy, that's the main challenge. To what Sarah just said, one thing that I don't know how to. I agree completely with what she said, but I'm thinking that I mean, there's so many challenges. If first of all, in terms of the attention span of the American people, absolutely true. If the Russians actually fire, anti-aircraft at some plane that ends up having an American pilot in, and then Washington says, well, this was flying over Poland or Alaska or something. Like we actually had an encounter a couple days ago. If you have one or two of those things, there is still I think a deep enough echo in the population back to 1965 or whatever, 1962 in particular, where that will make people wake right up. And if that happens, I think you're going to see a lot of people say, well, what are we doing in the first place? Why are we there? Ukraine, what's Ukraine? Get out of there! Stop! Because they see the threat of a real war that can land. That can land in their lap. None of the wars that we've engaged in since we got over the Vietnam syndrome, as they put it in 1991 war on Iraq, have touched the American mainland or any of its territories really in any way, other than the 9/11 airplanes. And that was a tremendous shock, by the way. But the threat of an actual nuclear war with Russia on the front page for even 30 seconds will change the political configuration in this country in a heartbeat.
Sarah, your thoughts? I mean, ultimately, are we looking at, when we look at Ukraine, it has become the central battlefield for basically this fight, war between Russia and the rest of the West. Okay, I don't have Sarah's audio.
My apologies. I look at this as one of the fronts in the wider world war. This is just one of the ways that it's East versus West. When we look at the buildup for Iran, that's just another prong in the East versus West war. So I don't necessarily look at it as Russia versus the West. I look at it as this is a reorganization of the world order, and it's mostly East and global South versus West. So that's exactly how I view it, and I think that's how the West is starting to view it as well. I'd be curious to hear our other guests' thoughts on the same question.
Yeah, what about that, Don? How do you see it? And if that is the case, if this is the war that, as she said, between the East and West in general, how likely is it that it will be ending soon?
The latter part of that, I don't want to touch. I have my hopes and wishes like 24 hours from now, but who knows? I think she's absolutely correct. And I think, in fact, Trump's campaign in 2016, whether it was his intent or him just riding the wave of, of reality, reflected a change inside the elite here, whether it was a dominant faction or just some faction that developed and that there actually some tension between them. I don't know. All we know is what we see on TV and read in the newspapers or whatever. But there's clearly a change, like an epical change almost, as the Dr. Tony Montero puts it. And we're talking seriously about, a bloc that could consist of, the BRICS countries, the global South generally, against, say, the U.S. and the EU. And also, though, there's even sort of a Kissingerian, God help me for making up that word if I did, symmetry to this, where on the one hand, maybe the West would like to, some people think Trump wants to engage Russia as a white European ally against the black and brown and yellow global South and the East. Others see the EU, like China engaging with the EU, as this new bloc, BRICS and et cetera, engaging the EU as against the United States. It's kind of in flux in terms of potentiality. I don't know what's really going on behind the scenes, but, there are vast markets and manufacturing capacity and military capabilities, among other things, that are grouped in some rather amorphous ways right now, and that could shift in the way they're grouped.
Sarah, your perspective of why Europe seems to be extremely adamant about continuing this even now, even though obviously we've seen the situation and the major toll that this has taken on both countries, but especially now Ukraine, and it doesn't seem like the Ukrainians are headed towards victory. So why continue this? Why, especially the Europeans, are insisting on this?
I think it can almost be boiled down to something as simplistic as pride, or just this is the way we've always done things. They don't like the Russians. The Western Europeans, the Baltics, the Scandinavians don't really like the Russians historically or currently due to whatever past divides there have been. There's still a lot of grudges in that way. What this seems to be doing is actually creating a schism within Europe. You're seeing the Eastern Bloc sort of move a little bit towards Russia, while the Western Bloc and the Baltics are saying absolutely not. I'm not really sure why Europe decided to die on this hill. I didn't know that they had the foresight to know that Trump would be tanking everything, but I think that at this point, all of their eggs are in one basket, and they just don't really have a choice. It's kind of all or nothing at this point.
And your perspective, Sarah, how long do you think, or when do you think that this war would be able to come to an end?
in its entirety, or the SMO? The SMO could last for years if needed. What we're hearing now is that, we're getting into the muddy season in Ukraine. What that usually means is immediately following that, Russia will gear up for some sort of offensive. What we're hearing is that they will push for an offensive in Zaporozhye, which means that they're going to probably wind up going for Odessa. That means that we're looking at least another year, and that's an extremely conservative estimate. So Russia's going to keep going until they're satisfied. And just like you're showing this clip, Hungary and Slovakia are now being pushed closer to Russia. So that the EU is actually doing things to actually increase the schism, to further divide everyone and to sort of keep them at each other's throats. Okay. So this could last as long as they have the stamina to do it.
All right, and on that note, I thank both of you for being with me. Sarah Bils, retired U.S. Navy officer out of Seattle. Don DeBar, journalist and commentator out of New York.
Thank you.
And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashim. We hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.